it's interesting, and I want to sort of switch gears here. We spoke about the present, and we spoke about your past. You're also an author of 13 books, right? And a lot of that has to do with the future and futurism.
Right.
You wrote an interesting book on microbiome or microbes and viruses,
Right.
and mainly, human beings are more sort of, we think we're in control, but it's the microbes that are in effect controlling us.
Seems like
It
it.
seems like it. So can you talk a bit about that?
Well, one of the things that was really interesting in the last few years, right, is what we call the microbiome, which is the total number of entities and species that live within us, and we're talking like huge amount, huge numbers.
I mean, hundreds of billions.
Hundreds of billions. There were, and that's been criticized recently, but I'm sorry, a few years back, there were, a lot of some scientists saying that something, I can't remember the exact number, but something like 70% or 80% of your genes were actually, genes of microbes within your body, not your own genes. But that's been sort of debunked recently. But there is still a large proportion of what we have inside us that essentially are alien bodies within us. So that is really interesting when you think about what does it mean exactly to be human. And research now on the microbiome seems to see correlation and maybe causality between mental health problems and your microbiome, health-related problem and what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, health-related problems in your microbiome, even the way you think, and there's even seems to be some link with autism.
The type of food you want to eat, the desire to eat.
Yes. So it seems to be, quite enmeshed with who we are. And it's actually fascinating. But what does it mean to be Daniel Jamil or Ollivier Dyens when you think about all of these things? What does it mean that we have all of these living beings within us? And on top of that, your cells supposed to, your whole cell makeup supposed to change every 6 or 7 years. Yeah. And why do we still believe that we're the same person? Why do we still have this thread within our head that, from birth to now, in my case, and for you also, you're much younger than I am, you still believe you're the same person. You've grown, you've matured, but you still are the same person. It's quite fascinating, and to me it's a beautiful area to explore, because the same way as we just discussed with young people, these types of discovery push the envelope and they force us to think, okay, the world is more complex than we think, and the world needs to be seen from a different perspective, and what we believe are definite clear borders of what the human can be and is actually much less well defined, and that opens up all sorts of possibilities. Suddenly, it's when we realize, for example, genetic makeup, that there's very little differences between, it's almost like, there's almost no differences between you and I genetically, because, between us and a primate, there's about 2% genetic difference, and we share 60% of our genes with a fly, right? So between you and me, there's absolutely...
That's crazy, no? I mean, like, small amount of variation in the genome is the difference between, a fly or a chimpanzee and us. And I mean, we'll definitely talk about CRISPR-Cas9, but in the future, once we start to enhance, will those proto-humans see us in the same way? Anyways, but
to me, what's really interesting, Danielle, is that suddenly there's like a sort of a kinship that can be thought of between every living being. We share, and then you have to say, racism between what we used to call race, which of course human races do not exist. There's just one race, one species, but different.
Although at one point in time, we had other great apes as well, right? Like,
right.
I mean, one of the major theories is our biggest accomplishment as Homo sapiens is we've wiped out Neanderthals or sort of interbreed. I mean, there's multiple theories, but at the end of the day, we basically came out as a winner, and the rest did not survive. So,
I think we're the only species that has only one sort of subspecies of it, right?
Yeah.
I think we're the only one. But to me, what's really interesting when you push the envelope like this is suddenly how can you even imagine racism when there's between you and I, two different individuals, there's essentially no differences genetically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The differences we see are extraordinarily superficial. And it's the same thing with the microbiome. What does it mean about the fluidity, if we go back to the earlier conversation, the fluidity of gender, when there's fluidity even in your ontology, who you are, what you think you are? They're just, you said it. I mean, what you eat can be influenced by your microbiome, but the way you eat can also change your microbiome, which will probably change the way your brain works. So that means, fluidity is not a fantasy because it exists everywhere. And it also, again, to me, it's really interesting that the same way that we can imagine that a human being is a machine, it's a thinking machine, we can also, because we can see that behavior is something you can predict, and you have a lot of data, you can see that behavior is something you can pull out of data easily, and that human beings are extraordinarily predictable.
On average, yes.
On average.
Given enough data.
Right,
Yeah.
given enough data
And
on
in a
average.
crowd, yeah.
But then you can also say that, well, if that's the case, then we're all machines in this world, like living machines, right? But you can also say that, well, the positive spin on this is that those machines that we are, that are able to experience beauty and the sublime and art, maybe these feelings are also universal. Maybe they belong to the entire living realm at different level.
So I love the sort of, the rosy picture and the optimist
Told you
view.
the glass is full.
No, and honestly, I'm an optimist as well. However, one thing that does strike me as a bit more dystopian, and it's sort of how you mentioned, right, that genetically we're the same, right, and yet we have all these variations around, whether it's racism, tribal mentality. I mean, that's the best way to call it. And it's not just human beings, right? Wolf packs, lion prides, they all exhibit that, right? I'm part of tribe A versus B. When we get into a point where humans start genetically enhancing themselves, right? They're cognitively smarter, they're stronger, they're opening neural pathways that, potentially we couldn't even problem solve at that level or at that dimension. What sort of kinship would they have, right? And maybe
with
it's
each other or with
let's say the humans versus the post-humans, or I believe Hillary calls it the Homo Deus, right? Like the post-humans. I mean, we seem to be heading towards that sort of a landscape. Maybe it's going to be, everyone gets enhanced and, human population uplifts. But having read enough history, that's not always the case. So now we sort of have this situation as dystopian where you have a small minority, which is, we do have a small minority right now, that, Pareto principle applies, that, has a lot of resources.
Right.
They will use those resources to further enhance themselves, and for the first time in human history, biologically, right? And that's a big shift. And then there's another macro trend happening, which is with intelligence and resources, right? Automation and AI. So a king, as an analogy, a king in the medieval times still required human beings because they were the most intelligent resource available, right? I mean, that's sort of the argument. But today, so I mean, you need peasants to work. You need an army who's going to fight for you. But today, why would a general, need an army that needs to be fed, that could mutiny, that has all these thoughts, right? Versus, automated robots and drones that can do all the work. And so it's sort of like I see two macro trends coming in. One is automation and AI, and then the other one is genetic enhancements. And of course, it's going to be expensive. And once that small segment of society starts to uplift, would they even identify themselves as the same species as the rest of humanity? Because if you look at Columbus, when he goes back, it's a pretty clear case, right, of how it turned out. So anyways, I'm just throwing out a couple of macro trends and yeah.
they're difficult questions, but let's go back to your Columbus example. I think that if we look at the way we treated human beings 500 and 600 years ago and 1,000 years ago, and the way we try to treat them today, there's a huge amount of improvement. I'm not saying things are rosy
perfect,
everywhere, but in principle, in the fact that we have human rights charters all over the world, and it's part of most constitutions around the world. And we have the, what's it called, the International Tribunal for Crimes Against Humanity. And, these things actually make a difference. And even in war, we have terms of engagement. And
Geneva Convention.
Right, Geneva Convention, terms of engagement, things you cannot do. There's a huge amount of improvement in the way we treat each other and the way we treat the world. The circle of empathy keeps increasing. It used to be me and my direct kins, and then it became me and my family, me and my extended family, me and my village, and now it's us and almost the environment, right? So for some people and a lot of people, it's now we're adding non what's the word would be organic, non-animal things within the circle of empathy.
Yeah.
So the trend is actually very positive. Now, to answer your question is, I think the mistake most of us do, myself included, is, first of all, we see the world in linear terms, right, that we project from today. We also see the world in a way that the future will happen to us. I think the future is much more a bit like quantum theory in the sense I'm not an expert, so I'm just talking very metaphorical terms here. But it's like all the possibility exists until you act upon them and they collapse into reality, right? Yep. So the future is not something that happens to us; it's something we keep building, not just moving towards. We actually keep building it by the decisions we make every day. And I think Kevin Kelly has said it best. I think it's one of my favorite quotes. He said, technology brings a lot of good and a lot of bad. And he said, I believe it brings a bit more good than bad. And over 1,000 years, it makes a huge difference. So, we tend to see it. Is it good or is it bad? Well, it's like human beings, right? It's complexly good and bad at the same time. And the phone's the best example. The iPhone, the smartphone's the best example of, the thing that brings a lot of bad things and a lot of great things. Probably a bit more good than bad. Now, so I'm not, again, I'm an optimist. And when I see the trend, 1,500 years ago, anyone who have said, one day we'll have a world where owning a slave will be considered despicable and illegal, people would have said, yes, such a dreamer.
Yeah.
500 years ago was probably the case too.
Same thing in monarchy, right?
Right.
That was a shocker. Karl Marx and that was a big shock to the system. Yeah.
For me, when the Soviet Union fell, when the wall fell, I was like, oh my God! It was just so the future is not linear. We tend to, and I think the data is very clear on this, is that, for every variable that you measure, things are improving in this world. And Steven Pinker and other people have said it very clearly, Hans Rosslin also, right, is that there's less crimes, and the crime rate, plummets, has been plummeting for a number of years. People are kinder to each other, even though that's not what we perceive, but the actual reality is very different from what we perceive from